Britain will recognise a Palestinian state when the Labour Party forms the next UK government. In 19 days, Labour is set to win a massive majority, and in one of its manifesto promises, it says the following: Palestinian statehood is the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. So why are Labour campaigners panicking that Gaza could be about to cost the party a whole bunch of seats?
Welcome to the Daily Objective, day 255 of the war in Israel. Today, as you heard from the introduction, we're talking about how the Labour Party here in Britain, despite this massive capitulation to the Muslim votes, is not perceived enough by them as a move or as a outcome of their perceived strength of voting. So for the first time here in Britain, we see a sectarian kind of vote, a vote dictated by the religious or the ethnic group of the voters, which will make a massive difference to the outcome of the next parliament. And the interesting thing here is that the Labour Party historically gets about 70% of the Muslim vote. The Tory party, the Conservatives, only get about 25%. And despite this huge bias towards the Labour vote, the Muslim vote this time organizes itself in a slightly different way, because they see Gaza as one of the main issues. They see what's going on in Israel right now as one of the main issues. And this is turning out to be quite an interesting development, because the Labour Party are actually realizing this, and they are really worried about the outcome of some of their seats. There are 650 seats in the whole parliament, and despite having a projected really high majority at the end of the election, they still worry about the loss of few seats. And some of the big names, some of the people that are going to be ministers of state after the Labour win, are actually being targeted by so-called independent. Every time we mention independent, it actually refers to the Muslim vote, the candidate which is put in the particular constituency against the mainstream parties.
Now, some of those independent candidates were formerly members of the Labour Party and chose to resign from the Labour Party over the policy of the Labour Party. Some of them were effectively deselected or kicked out by the Labour Party for one reason or another. We'll come to why in a moment. And some of them were never attached to the Labour Party in the first place and are standing as independent candidates. But they're standing on a Gaza platform, as Gaza being the most important issue. And they're hitting these Labour constituencies hardest because that's where they want to draw their biggest vote from. Because it's important to say how much Labour normally draws the vote from the Muslim population. It often draws like 70% or so. I think in a recent poll, although Gaza was the top issue for voters generally at only about 3% of the population, for those that considered it the top issue, which was about 80, for those that considered it the top issue, about 86% of those were considering not voting for Labour and for voting for a different party. Now, that could be the independents, like I mentioned earlier, but it's not just about the independents, is it? There's other parties that the Muslim Vote campaign is encouraging people to vote for instead, and some of those other parties could be where Labour loses its seats, or some of the seats that it's always held, or some of the seats that it hoped to make up that massive majority with. Exactly how many remains to be seen, but it's certainly nibbling at the heels and can provide a very interesting flavour of this election when the result comes on July the 5th.
Just to provide some background, the 650 constituencies, which correspond to a elected member of parliament per constituency, are effectively areas of roughly the same size population. And they're changed every 10, 20 years just to reflect, just to make sure each constituency is roughly the same number of people.
You mean the boundaries change, don't you? Yeah. They say largely the same, but they adjust the boundaries to keep them at about 75,000 voters per constituency.
Yeah. The the politician who gets elected for that particular constituency is the one that gets the majority of the votes. There is no second prize for the winner. So if you only win by a vote, you win the constituency and you go into parliament. You are the member of parliament for that constituency. And of course, it's a first past the post. And because this is a parliamentary constituency, parliamentary democracy, the party which gets the highest number of votes, the majority of votes, gets to form the government. And the leader of the party becomes automatically the prime minister. So when we are talking about Keir Starmer as the prime minister, it's because he's forecast to be the leader of the party which is going to get the majority. And that is why in the previous few years, we've changed prime ministers like socks, because the party, in this case, the Conservative Party, decided to get rid of their leaders, and the new leader automatically gets elected prime minister.
Yeah, and we'll come to it in a bit, I'm sure. But the actual Keir Starmer is actually one of those facing some competition from an independent candidate in his own constituency, who does have a large majority. We'll discuss whether that's likely to happen or not. But there are certainly some other high-profile candidates who are vulnerable in this point of view, and there's a number of parties that could challenge them. Not just these independents that we mentioned, but the British Workers' Party is one of them, and that, of course, is George Galloway's party. He's the firebrand, strongly pro-Muslim candidate who won recently in Rochdale in Manchester, upsetting the Labour vote there in a by-election that took place in Rochdale, and he's one of those who've been really campaigning hard on a Palestinian state, and is well known for his Russia Today appearances. And we've covered him on this channel. There are some shows about him on this channel. He's quite a piece of work, to say the least.
Yeah, it looks like, of course, the Labour Party itself is a bizarre party. It incorporates, it keeps together all sorts of people which come from fairly opposite end of the spectrum. For example, you have the wealthy urban lefty, you have the working classes, the blue collar kind of people, the hardcore socialists like Corbyn or formerly Galloway, and the Walkerati, and at the same time the Muslims. So you end up having this ridiculous coalition of queers of Palestine. So you have the woke LGBT environmentalist side of the things, which goes hand in hand with the Muslim vote. And you can imagine this party has such a huge amount of conflicting interest that the leader is pulled left, right, and center. And this particular leader, Keir Starmer, is not very good at standing his ground. So in the last 2 years, perhaps, he must have U-turned so many times. I wonder if he still knows which direction he's going. And that is why the Muslim vote is putting such a pressure on the whole Labour Party.
Keir Starmer certainly, you could say, U-turned, or his position has transitioned across the period since October the 7th quite substantially. Initially, after October the 7th, he was talking about Israel's right to defend itself and strongly talking about the need to return the hostages. But that gradually transitioned a bit into started hesitating to call a ceasefire when lots of the other kind of parties on the left were doing the same, or those of the Corbynite end of the spectrum, the hard left end of his conglomerate, they were calling for it very early on, bearing in mind that Jeremy Corbyn wanted to recognise a Palestinian state on day one back in his election in 2019 when he was leader. So although you could argue that this policy of the Labour Party now is not so far from that. Now he's kind of supporting a conditional ceasefire, conditional on the release of the hostages, but has sort of fudged into part of the peace process. But it's a complicated thing to judge exactly what they mean, and they've kept it intentionally vague. They're trying to appeal to all factions within their party. And of course, they do have Jewish members of parliament. They do have quite a Jewish voters in the past who voted in various constituencies for Labour candidates. So they're trying to balance that element, which of course is much smaller in numbers than the Muslim vote, but is still a significant part of their overall appeal. And of course, the wider centrally based electorate that is much more mellow, much more mild on calling for ceasefires, etc.
Just to confuse things a bit more, if in case you were beginning to see some sense, here in Britain, the Labour Party is represented by the red colour, and the Tory Party by the blue colour, which is exactly the opposite of Democrats and Republicans. So bear that in mind when you see, especially the background of today's thumbnail, the red colour behind Keir Starmer is because the Labour Party is represented by the red colour.
And don't think that because he's wearing blue and I'm wearing red, that reflects any allegiance whatsoever, because it certainly doesn't.
No, because ultimately, really, the two major parties, Labour and Tories, are roughly the same thing. They are both pro big state. They're both pro massive welfare spending, and they are super into green environmental stuff. That's why we can't do it in the best situation economically right now, because you cannot force the
two wings. Yeah.
And the outcome of either policies is always the same: more state, bigger state, more power devolved to technocrats, and effectively you end up with all the same.
It's worth saying that the last election, just as a reminder, back in 2019, that the Conservatives got 365 seats. And right now, projections are that they're going to get closer to 100 seats, and they may even fall below 100 on some predictions. And it's looking like a huge majority for Labour. So we have to ask the question, I think, why are they worried about this? And I think possibly the place to start is to look at the actual wording in the manifesto itself, because the manifesto from the Labour Party, it's a 137-page document. Of course, a lot of it's just pictures of Keir Starmer and various people from different ethnic backgrounds, etc. Everybody represented, and all the kind of puff you expect in manifestos, not just the wording. But there is only really pretty much a single paragraph based on their Gaza policy. So I think it's probably worth telling you what's in that, so you get a really clear idea of what we're talking about.
Yeah, I hope you haven't eaten recently, because this is going to really turn your stomach. There's so much wrong in what I'm about to read that I don't really know where to start. Apart from the first phrase that Richard already mentioned, Palestinian statehood is the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. It's like, really? We're going to pick this one apart in a minute, I think. The next one is, it is not in the gift of any neighbor, and is also essential to the long-term security of Israel. I mean, this is really wrong.
The next bit says, we are committed to recognizing a Palestinian state as a contribution to a renewed peace process, which results in a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. And free puppies for everyone, no doubt. Because I mean, that just sounds like wishful thinking. It sounds like primacy of consciousness thinking, to be honest, to put it in objectivist terms, doesn't it? But yes,
I mean, if you argue that philosophy is not the motive engine of people's action, just read this thing from this manifesto. Somebody believes that inalienable rights to create a state which is based on the destruction of individual right and civilization is actually a thing. I mean, these people don't know what rights are, and don't clearly even understand what the Palestinian people want to do with the state, i.e. destroy Israel. This escapes the people who wrote this manifesto is frankly unbelievable. And to be honest, you can easily understand that whoever's behind this knew exactly what they were saying. I mean, it is not the gift of any neighbor, and is also essential to the long-term security of Israel. Really? On what planets anyone would believe that a Palestinian state would be a long-term security for Israel. It's just the thing, just absolutely crazy.
Yeah. I just want to acknowledge a couple of super chats. Thank you very much for your super chats. We do appreciate those. And anyone can always leave super thanks after any show covered on this channel. So if you miss it live, please do that. Jonathan Honig, first of all, for $3.99. Thanks, Jonathan, regular supporter and, of course, the show host. We appreciate it. And Bonnie Bertrand, also a real regular supporting this channel. Thank you very much, Bonnie. And any comments that Bonnie makes on this or any other show, you should really listen to be honest, because Bonnie's absolutely on it when it comes to all of the issues that we cover here.
Going back to why the Labour Party is so scared, well, in 2019, when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, of course, there was a big issue with anti-Semitism. He effectively allowed anti-Semitism to be widespread and even come out in the open in his running of the party. So much so that there was actually an inquiry run after he left, which found a couple of instances, actually 4 points, where the Labour Party actually broke the law in terms of being too openly anti-Semitic. So, it's something that don't remind you, the party of the do-gooders never remind you this kind of stuff, but they actually broke the law in terms of not having safeguards, make sure that the party wasn't turning to anti-Semitic. But what really I find incredible is that the current leader of the Labour Party was number 2 to Corbyn, really. So he was campaigning 2019 and 17 with Corbyn, for the kind of stuff Corbyn was standing and representing in the party. And now he's coming out pretending to be the great guy that loves everyone. But, it's the same guy who was quite happy to go on a platform and say, vote Labour, vote for Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn could have become our prime minister, and Keir Starmer was supporting him.
And just recently, he came out and said in interviews that he only supported him because he thought he wasn't going to win. As if that's an argument, and as if we can trust a word he says now, for example. But I think it might make sense to home in on Jeremy Corbyn himself and this election, which is coming up, because his own constituency that he's sitting in Islington North, in an area that's half of a borough essentially of Islington in London, in the centre of London, is an interesting case in point. He was essentially kicked out of the Labour Party, despite being the former leader who stood for that party at the election last year. And he's in a constituency where he's no longer the Labour candidate, despite having a majority of 26,000, so a big hefty majority. But he's decided to stand as an independent candidate, and at his campaign launch, he put Palestine front and center. He basically said that his campaign was about Palestine, poverty, and racism. That's about how he's fighting it. And so that is going to be a very interesting litmus test as to where people vote in that constituency at the time, because there's various things going on here. It's not just about Palestine and Gaza and the approach to it. It's also about that split in the Labour Party that Marco was referring to earlier, the two wings of it. And sometimes even an issue as big and important to many people as this one is just used as a wedge in order to separate the centre left from the hard left of Corbyn. So many people may well vote for Corbyn because he's the hard left, the end of the spectrum, as opposed to necessarily because of his stance on Palestine, on Gaza. But he's going to be standing against a Labour candidate, which is the Labour candidate supported by the new leader. So we're going to have to see what happens there. But there's a very good likelihood that Jeremy Corbyn will win that seat as an independent, and therefore will be calling for the policy he called for as leader, which was to recognise Palestine as a state immediately.
Yeah, since 2019, after Keir Starmer became the new leader of the Labour Party, there was a kind of movement to get rid of the far left extreme element within the Labour Party, and that's why Corbyn was kicked out in the first place. But other people like Diane Abbott, for example, who was she has her constituency is fairly close to Corbyn in the first place, but they are very close also personally. So she was another element who was supposed to be kicked out of the party, or at least marginalized. But then they managed to create a massive cock-up. So until the last minute, the Labour Party didn't know if Diane Abbott would have been or not their own candidate. Ended up, she's still a candidate for the Labour Party, probably just because they didn't get the house in gear. They didn't manage to put somebody else against her. But in case you don't know about that, Abbott, she's the kind of person who does has got the same mathematical ability as Hamas in Gaza. She quotes number totally randomly. She doesn't seem to be very rational under the point of view.
At the last election, it was a particularly amusing interview with her when she was talking about hiring new numbers of policemen, and she gave a figure for the overall total for how many policemen will be hired and what it would cost a year to have these extra policemen. And the presenter pointed out to her that meant that each policeman was being paid just £30 a year. So that gives you a flavour of her ability to think ahead. Now, I just wanted to mention something that somebody wrote in the chat. So this is from Jesse Reichbach. Although it's not officially a super chat, it is an interesting point and refers to what we said earlier. He's mentioned, is there a lot of racism in the UK these days? At least that isn't coming from the left itself. Well, I would definitely argue no. I think in the scheme of things, I think the UK is one of the least racist countries on the planet, to be honest. But of course, as with everywhere at the moment, and the woke attitude to defining things through race, it sometimes rubs people up the wrong way when everything is seen through the color of your skin lens in terms of hiring and those kind of things, and how adverts are done and things are presented and policy is driven and people are described in terms of whether you can stop and search for weapons based knives on the streets when you're trying to handle crime for the police, that kind of thing. And of course, having police officers kneel for BLM, all of that kind of stuff is the kind of stuff that sort of generates resentment for some people because it's endlessly pushed. So I would say that, the UK used to be colour blind, but of course colour has been put front and centre of a lot of lefties' views of the world. And of course that's infiltrated into how many people talk. But despite all that, I definitely would say it's not a racist country.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, if you look at the number of people who are trying to come to the UK, clearly you wouldn't go to a place if you were such a racist place. And it's true. Right now we have an issue with immigration, but that's mainly caused by the fact that we have such generous welfare state that immigration, to be honest, in my opinion, pales compared to how much money we waste on welfare. So yes, the election will be fought for some people on the basis of immigration issues, but that's not really a significant issue. People like to travel in and out of the country, and there's massive collaboration and friendliness towards people from all over the world. So I wouldn't worry about that.
So I think it's important to answer why are Labour worried in this election? They're certainly worried for the fact that they could well lose a few seats or not gain the seats they would have expected to. Now, one of those that we can focus in on is Chingford and Woodford Green. That's also in London. That's in northeast London. It's a bit more suburban than the Islington North that we mentioned earlier. And that's the seat of Ian Duncan Smith currently. He's a former leader of the Conservative Party. So he used to, although he was never Prime Minister, he never did particularly well as leader. He was a former leader of the Conservative Party. He's currently got a small majority of 1,200 or so. So he's been vulnerable for some time. And the candidate that he's up against is, in the last election, it was a Labour candidate called Faiza Shaheen, who is often known as the Chingford Corbynite because she's definitely very left wing and was seen campaigning along with Jeremy Corbyn and with people like Hugh Grant at the last election, who came along to support her campaign back in 2019. She was the Labour candidate back then. But literally days before they announced the election here, or after announcing the election here for this election coming up, she was deselected as a Labour candidate, and the party decided to drop her because of some anti-Semitic tweets that she'd allegedly liked in the past, and therefore she was no longer the Labour candidate. And they've put in a new Labour candidate, but she's decided to stand as an independent. And given that lots of people in that constituency went out and campaigned for her last time, and she's got lots of local recognition, there is a high chance that she could seriously split the vote between Labour, the new Labour candidate, and her, and that could even allow the former leader of the Conservative Party to retain the seat, and that would be a big blow to Labour, simply from a as a symbolic measure for sure.
As I mentioned earlier on, there is a big sectarian vote coming up on this election. It's never happened before, so much so that the Muslim vote is actually organized. There is a website called The Muslim Vote, which effectively lists which constituencies are fair game targets, and also tells the Muslim voters which people to vote for. They suggest, this is the candidate in that, the official candidate in that, the previous candidate in that constituency, and this is the guy you should vote for. And it's quite interesting that it's not always an independent, i.e. a Muslim party vote, but it's often a Green Party. We saw in a recent local election that the Green Party was actually standing on a very much pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian manifesto. And some of the reaction of the winners was like shouting "Allahu Akbar" and "We are coming for you." This all kind of very Muslim rhetoric, if I may say so. And this particular website suggests to Muslim voters to target certain
constituencies,
existing MP, based on the way they voted for the ceasefire a few months ago. And as I mentioned, some of the big major political beasts, if you like, in the Labour Party are being targeted. One of which is actually the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. The guy who's going against it, funny enough, is a South African who used to be a member of the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa, the African National Congress. And he decided to stand against him on the, of course, pro-Palestinian platform. It's going to be interesting to see if Keir Starmer managed to pull this one off.
And this is a guy who likes to point out that his mother was a Viennese Holocaust survivor. Where have we heard people doing that before? And of course, he's mentioned things like the Holocaust doesn't justify the treatment of Palestinians, or words to that effect in the past. So he's certainly trying to raise his profile, and is an interesting link between South Africa, the current, the possible future prime minister, and the possibility that at least in theory he could lose his seat. I think the other big beasts include people like David Lammy, who's currently the shadow foreign secretary, and Wes Streeting, who could be the health secretary. He's particularly vulnerable, again, in a London seat. In some of the areas of like Birmingham, and in Birmingham, particularly in the Midlands especially, some of the constituencies there have like a 55% or 50% or 40%, depending which one we're talking about, Muslim population to them. So that vote could be particularly decisive when it comes to which candidate in those constituencies actually makes it over the line. I did want to just mention a couple of things here. I noticed that Bonnie has she's been a member for 25 months. She says, she took me by surprise, and I just want to say thank you. So thank you. It's all down to the rationality of Razi and his staff. So super rare today. We do appreciate the return of the compliment. Thank you very much, Bonnie. So anybody else we can talk about or mention?
Well, I think we're running out of time. So there's no the reality show after this episode. However, if you really fancy some objectivist take on some of the events in the last few months, you can head back to the Briefly Objective, the sister channel of this channel, where you can find lots of videos. So if you share, like, and comment on it, or leave super thanks, whatever, you will really help to spread some sanity out there to try and see the events of today's world from an objectivist point of view.
And those videos include people's voices. For it includes James Valiant, Harry Binswanger, Yaron Brook. All sorts of voices are on there. So as well as the voices of all the presenters you hear on this channel, pretty much. So do check those out, and please do like that channel. We're trying to increase the subscribers on that channel. So thank you very much. Good to see you all, and we'll be back tomorrow here on this channel for the Daily Objective. Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.